Welcome to the Fighting Fascism series, a series that's being hosted by the Center for Political Education that aims to sharpen our understanding of how social movements in the United States organize against fascist oppression and repression and violence, especially as it escalates across this country every day. Just a quick overview of the series before we begin. Tonight's session is the second in our Fighting Fascism series, and it's being co-sponsored by our friends and comrades at Detention Watch Network and Trabajadores Unidos, Workers United, or TUBU. DWN is a national coalition building power through collective advocacy, grassroots organizing, and strategic communications to abolish immigration detention in the United States. And TUBU is a regional Bay Area immigrant worker center that stands at the intersection of economic, racial justice, and immigrant rights. We're also joined by the Instituto de Educación Popular del Sur de California, which undertakes a Freirean approach to popular education in their work with day laborers in Los Angeles, and whose mission is to contribute towards the transformation of creating a more humane and democratic world through the use of popular education. And specifically, their goal is to organize and educate low-income community members who want to resolve problems in their own communities. In the first session we had 2 weeks ago, we talked with Rachel Herzing and Robin D.G. Kelly about the centrality of criminalization to the fascist program. As Robin and Rachel have talked about numerous times in their work, that criminalization is rooted in America's history of enslavement, Jim Crow segregation, and mass imprisonment. That criminalization also extends to migrant communities, who have also been a reliable scapegoat for the kinds of xenophobic white supremacist forces that have emerged and reemerged across the American landscape throughout its history. As Rachel mentioned in the first session, that while what happened in Los Angeles just a few weeks ago deserves close examination, and we'll do that a bit with our speakers tonight, we don't have to wait for the National Guard to occupy our neighborhoods, because so many of our communities have already been experiencing and dealing with law enforcement and the enforcement arm of fascism through their long-term experiences managing everyday policing, from Fed cops to border cops or local sheriffs. And that means that Black and brown immigrant communities, like multi-generational Black communities across the country, are already enmeshed in the fight against fascism, because that criminalization that fascism relies upon centers their lives and directly impacts their material conditions from the start. After all, the torchbearer of American fascism today, Donald Trump, first announced his candidacy with a tirade of hateful slurs and lies aimed at vilifying immigrants, and he hasn't relented since. And that brings us back to LA, because while what has been taking place in LA is shameful, dangerous, and incredibly destructive to migrant communities in California and elsewhere, it's also evidence at the depth of strength, resilience, and resistance to fascism that exists and is needed to overcome the all too frequent anticipatory obedience we are witnessing from the upper strata of our society, universities, media conglomerates, and the like. Our speakers today represent some of the fiercest working class organizing on the front lines of the fight against fascism and for migrant justice in the country. I'll leave it to my dear comrade Chica to welcome our guests and get our conversation started for today. And thank you all for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Chica with Center for Political Education. I would like to just do some brief introductions of your bios before we get started with our conversation. So let me just welcome you all and say that Marcela Hernandez is the Director of Organizing at Detention Watch Network. Marcela is an abolitionist, queer, feminist organizer who has organized against US imperialism and the prison industrial complex, including surveillance, jails, prison, ICE, and CBP, and for immigrants, youth, BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and environmental justice rights. So welcome, Marcela. Next is Alejo, who is the executive director of TUBU, Trabajadores Unidos, Workers United. Alejo joined TUBU because she wanted to build a worker center that centered the experiences of immigrant and BIPOC workers who want to challenge capitalism and reclaim their working class collective bargaining power through direct action and political education at work. Welcome, Alejo. And finally, we have Megan Ortiz, who's the executive director of Instituto de Educación Popular del Sur de California. Megan is an LA-based Nuyorican of working for a long-time nonprofit that works with day laborers and household workers on organizing, educational, and policy strategies in order for them to change the world they live in, especially in terms of labor and immigration rights, but also as whole individuals. So welcome, Megan, and welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being with us tonight to discuss the fight against fascism and its relationship to migrant communities on the front lines. Okay, so I want to start with Marcella. If I can ask you, can you just walk us through and help us understand some of the history and the story of how we got to this present moment? You know, we have a president who ran on a platform of mass deportations. We have both major political parties, kind of jockeying over who's tougher on the border. We have ICE enforcement and immigration detention as a sort of a regular fixture of this carceral landscape in our country. So I want to ask you, what do you see as the continuities from earlier periods? And also, what's different about immigration enforcement in this current period as compared to previous administrations, which we know were also engaged in mass arrest and deportation?
Yes, thank you for the invitation today, and it's great to share this space with other poderosas mujeres. I know probably a lot of folks joining, you're out there also in the fight on the streets or however you can support the fight against all the attacks our communities are facing and, uh, the attacks that immigrant communities are facing. So yeah, I mean, I think again, building from the last session, the US has a long history, right, of targeting Black and Indigenous communities since they came to colonize Turtle Island in order to advance white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, right, from policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act to Japanese internment camps to policies that have criminalized migration even before agencies like DHS, which is the Department of Homeland Security, and ICE, Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, were created in 2002 after 9/11. And just to touch a little bit on some of those, that history, and to also illustrate how, right, it's been in the fabric of the history of this country, and that, both Democrats and Republicans have contributed to this. I want to share a little bit more about like the recent history of immigration enforcement. So we really saw one of the expansions of detention really be a response to Black immigrants coming to the US in the 1980s when Cuban and Haitian refugees were arriving to Florida's shores. And that's when we saw immigration policy began to really immaculate the criminal legal system of the US. And also, right, this was during the height of the war on drugs, which we know really is a war on people of color, working class people. In the 1980s, Congress amended the Immigration and Naturalization Act to require mandatory detention of immigrants that have been criminalized and charged with certain convictions. So, right, this meant that detention was automatic for those folks without a hearing or any consideration of the circumstances, which we know a lot of the circumstances are because there's a lack of resources in communities of color, because there's over-policing in these communities. And also, right, we really see agencies like DHS, like ICE, as part of the bigger prison industrial complex of the US. So it did build off of that history. And also something to note that was happening during the 80s as well, which, has happened before, but we also saw there was a lot of US intervention in other countries, such as El Salvador, against more socialist governments for capitalist interests. And that also caused a lot of violence and displacement of people. And, they came here to the US. So in the 1990s, we also saw a shift of this targeting of folks that were able to get some kind of status, specifically legal permanent residents. We saw policies like the 1996 laws that really targeted residents. We also saw things like the so-called Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, which is a misleading name, increased the scope of who could be subject to mandatory detention. And under Obama, we saw this narrative that started forming that a lot of people call the good versus bad immigrant narrative, where in a very public speech, he said, I'm targeting felons, not families. So like really demonizing people that have come into contact with police, with the criminal legal system, right? Again, knowing that those institutions are racist, they're unjust, and as I said, we know the police really targets communities of color. And we also saw some states being the test grounds for very harmful and violent anti-immigrant policies, such as in Arizona with SB 1070. I think, now present day, we are seeing a lot of those things also reemerge again. What was happening though in the 80s and 90s and under the Obama administration is that there was a lot of resistance as well, right? There was a lot of movements that formed to fight against these policies. I personally started to get more involved under the Obama administration with movements like the Not One More Detention and Deportation campaign, the I Side of LA coalition, the I Side of California coalitions. So we just saw this really powerful movements started by directly impacted folks, by folks that were supporting the immigrant community. And so there was very big shifts that we made to change all of these harmful policies. But now, right, under Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0, we are seeing, right, that these policies are coming back, and they're coming back with more force. And also under Biden, again, we really pushed back to change a lot of the damage that Trump had made in his first administration, and we saw very little change. We did have very great wins as a movement, but we continued to see the border militarization increase. There was also a lot of focus on attacking new immigrants versus immigrants that had been here for a long time. We saw things like Operation Lone Star in Texas, right? And now under this Trump administration, we're seeing all these old patterns intensify, build on each other at a greater and more violent scale, and using the new tools that they have, like technology. So we're seeing more suppression of dissent, which we have seen in the past, but at a bigger scale, and casting a wider net of who is suppressed. We're also seeing the expansion of the PIC and consolidation of a lot of those agencies. For example, we fought so much against 287 G agreements, which allow more police-sized collaboration in past years, where when the Trump administration started, there was 135 agreements, and now there's 1,001 agreements. So that was an increase by 641%. We're also seeing continuous and more strong collaboration between the US and other fascist governments, or the leveraging of US political power to do offshoring detention, such as what we saw with folks being transferred to Secot, a mega prison in El Salvador, or the third country deportations we're seeing to places like South Sudan. And we're also seeing attacks on all those movements and allies have made throughout history. But we continue to fight, and we are definitely seeing it at a bigger scale. And we are seeing how, these oppressive systems continue to evolve, to see how they continue to oppress our communities. But we're also seeing people fight back and coming back together and growing this movement. And I know Alejo and Megan are going to talk a little bit about how we're fighting back against these attacks.
Thank you, Marcela. Let me pass it to you, Alejo and Megan, both to speak a little bit about the story leading up to this moment. Like, how have your different formations been responding to the kinds of attacks that Marcela was walking us through? And what kinds of organizing and building have you all done that's led to your organizations being better prepared, perhaps, to meet this current moment?
Alejo, you wanted me to go first? Dale. Thank you, first of all, for having me here. Super honored, as Marcela said, to be among this group of badass mujeres. Marcela used to work at IDEPSCA, fun fact also. I know how fierce she is. And I've worked with Alejo on some stuff too. So really, really grateful. I think, following along the historic threads that Marcela was bringing us through, I think, attacks on day laborers and domestic workers specifically, especially as migrants, are nothing new. Also, I think and as an organization, IDEPSCA is, very rooted in understanding that history and also how that history gets carried over into present moment. For example, when we talk about household workers, aka domestic workers, we don't like that term, so we call them household workers. That work is rooted in the legacy of chattel slavery of Black individuals in the United States. And it is because of that legacy that right now we have, an overwhelmingly immigrant population doing that work without all the protections that other workers have in the United States. For example, in California and nationwide, but explicitly in California, sanctuary, whatever, household workers are explicitly excluded from health and safety protections when they work in private homes. So there's that vulnerability at that intersection of race and gender, right? And also work. And I think same in terms of day labor specifically, really thinking about the visibility of the day laborer workforce in the United States, seeking work in public places because of work policies, who when work is legalized versus when it is not, right? In air quotes, the day labor population specifically has been always easy to scapegoat, right? One of the key phases of nationalistic white supremacist fascism, right? Scapegoating. And I think, when day labor centers and that model came here out of Los Angeles and California specifically, when the day labor center model was created, it was a mix of like a response to attacks on this workforce, but also, to be really honest, in the beginning, there was a strong desire to disappear or make invisible or less visible the day labor workforce. So to be less offensive, if you will. When day labor centers started also, this also coincides with the growth of corporate big box multinational stores, right? Like Home Depot, for example. And in fact, one of the reasons why there are so many day labor centers in Los Angeles was because when Home Depot expanded in the LA region, it was actually written in as a city ordinance that they had to create safe spaces for day laborers. Fun fact, it is an ordinance that they're clearly not following. So these centers though have always been the target of white nationalist violence. We saw it post 9/11, post 9/11 2001. There's multiple shitty 9/11s, let's be honest. And then we also saw attacks on day laborers also during the rise of the Minutemen movement, right? In the 2005s, around then. So this means that like day labor center organizing and household worker organizing has always had to have both this progressive front trying to move forward labor rights, but also a defensive front, right, consistently. During Trump 1.0, well, before that even, for example, day labor centers are always the first thing to be cut from the city of Los Angeles budget, no matter who's the mayor, okay, just to be really clear about that. Meanwhile, we've seen, the police budget continue to grow, right? During Trump 1.0 specifically, what the day labor centers saw, and EDESCA operates 5 day labor centers in the city of Los Angeles, for one of the larger day labor organizations nationally because of that. What we saw was actually more harassment from what I would call deputized forces. For example, we had Home Depot hiring security companies who would come in, who were former cops, former ICE agents, asserting their private property rights and harassing day laborers in and around different Home Depots. And we actually did a campaign against that back during Trump 1.0. And we also saw the beginning of surveillance of day laborers during this time, literally people coming, taking photographs, trying to look at, worker logs, etc. To Marcela's point, what we see now is sort of an expansion in both of scale and very clear targeting. And we knew this was coming, frankly, right? President Trump named day laborers as a target, right, during his campaign. So that means that we were, even before the election results came out, we kind of scenario planned it out in terms of us thinking about, okay, what is this going to look like? What will we have to do? So that we were not starting from nothing. I think in terms of organizing ourselves as workers and advocates, but also really thinking beyond and trying to connect all those threads. So I think the sad reality is that it's not, not our first rodeo, as they say. So in that sense, we did have, and we have had leeway, lead time rather, to sort of organize ourselves. I think what's different about this time is just that we have, I said we have 5 day labor centers. In the last 2.5 months, those day labor centers have been the site of Border Patrol raids 14 times. So it really is about scale and just being able to keep up. It really is also about momentum as well. But I'm past my 5 minutes, so I'm gonna make sure I let her talk.
Thank you, Megan. And I'm also gonna do like a small little timer, I think, somewhere in there. I'll try to keep my own time. Yeah, no, I think thank you, Megan, for sharing that. I think one thing, as you all heard, TUWU, known as Trabajadores Unidos Workers United, we are a worker center in the Bay Area. We're a regional worker center. And one of the things that we always talk about, if you've met someone from TUWU, is like how we love just staying like in our lane. And our lane is like organizing, taking on employers, right? I think, like Megan said, so let me take some steps back. So a little bit of the types of workers that we work with is like we're a multi-industry worker center. That means that we work with restaurant workers, domestic workers, jornaleros, construction workers, janitors, all different types of work. We work with folks who are interested or curious and want to organize their workplace. We truly believe that in order to make changes, material changes too, that we really need to do that through a collective organizing model, which means that part of our discipline in organizing is being very transparent with folks who come to our worker center, that we don't do case management, that we're not gonna only file or wanna file with the labor commissioner, but that we really want to be able to support them in their leadership development, to be able to talk to their other coworkers and really be able to build what we believe is already there. But sometimes, we just need that reminder and that development of like collective bargaining power. Collective bargaining power doesn't only and shouldn't only feel like it lives in unions, right? They live in all the workplaces where our labor is needed, where working class people are needed to do the day-to-day. And oftentimes, again, all the things that Megan talked about, the exclusion of workers, the type of exclusion, right? Because they're very specifically towards like immigrant communities. It's often felt for our own community that, well, part of the American dream is getting the job, working really hard, right? And really trying to push through and endure like a lot of like wage theft, a lot of labor violations, and then most of all conditions inside of the workplace. We're talking about no such law says that your boss can yell at you, right, as you're working. But it doesn't mean that you need to. And we at Tubu believe that when workers get together and they organize, they are and should be able to bring their employer into the negotiating table and negotiate better wages, better conditions, and most of all, making sure that workers are not only, colleagues, but that they're compañeras, right? That they're compas at work, that they're able to talk to each other if they have questions about their work conditions. So we have been at Tubu really kind of sticking to that lane of like focusing on organizing, building majority. If we can build a majority, let's build a militant minority, but really making sure that workers, immigrant workers, low-wage workers are in the forefront of the fight. We also don't represent workers. We don't believe in that model. But what we do believe in is that direct action gets the goods. Being able to escalate on your employer, on your boss, that's what will get you the goods, right? Being able to collectively as workers understand that your labor inside of the workplace is the most important tool that your boss needs and that you can leverage. That is really important for us. So when things, were hitting, like when everything was happening in LA, which was like, actually, and I'm sure like Megan, we can talk about this in a little later, but we started hearing about ICE like activity around like May. Like there was like, I hate to say like this, but there was like sprinkles here and there and there. And I remember because, my family LA WhatsApp chat was going off. Like my conversations with my mom were like, hey, there's more activity, there's more activity. And I think kind of like what Marcela was saying, like we're not, a lot of us have been assessing this moment since last year. And from our first, like Megan said, rodeo on Trump 1.0. But we, like the rates that happened, I'm sorry, I'm just like kind of laughing because a lot of us did not expect it to go down the way it's been going down in LA, right? So what do you tell someone that's telling you, oh, there's like ICE activity? Know your rights, the red card, like, right, Megan? Like that's what you're saying. You're like, and you have rights and they can't do this and they can't just pull you. And then June 9th, June 6th happened, right? When we saw the biggest raid at that moment in LA at the warehouse and Ambience, where over 40 workers were kidnapped. And we're talking about a very, very strong militarization. Actually, the DEA was there first, FBI was there first, LAPD was there first, and then later ICE came, right? Like ICE came way later. So this very traumatic experience that's happening where folks are being, there's a lot of like TikToks, right? Like people were actually able to stand outside for hours, really filming and trying to document the things that were going inside. It also wasn't like a fast raid, right? They really set camp and like did their thing and horrible things that happened inside. And I do think that being able to get the support of Tubu to go down to LA and support these workers and get the support of being like, we're going to be able to send out 3 staff members that can and have experience organizing to support families in what happens next, right? And I will say, like, as Tubu, we were like, yo, like, we know how to take on an employer. Like, I know how to take on a Target, corporate, franchise, small business, right? Like, contractors, right, Megan? Like, we can engage with these folks, but like, how do you take on like the immigration machine? It's like a whole other thing. It's like and then I do think, Marcela also like joined, like that's how Marcela and I met, like really on the ground work, just like, so like, it's comrades who are like, hey, I know someone in LA who has experience, because I was just like, cool, because I'm kind of stuck, right? I can do the organizing, but like who and how what does our target look like? So I do think that being able to have that experience and that muscle of being able to move in, like, we don't use the word campaign mode a lot because campaigns get to run for a really long time. We call them like fights or shop fights. Like being able to have a lot of experience in shop fights and knowing how to move with like urgency, being trauma informed, while moving people who are in crisis into action was one of the best skills that like we could like really be able to hold really closely. One, we are part of the communities who are directly impacted. And then two, we also, as organizers, and some of us who are seasoned organizers, were like also being able to witness a very unique opportunity in front of us of organizing against an administration that is like actively trying to tell community that they're going to lose, right? And that we're taking your neighbors and we're taking your family. So I do think that having that type of experience, building that muscle, really prepared us for this moment. And it has also, what has also really prepared us is like, just like our own principles and values around centering those directly impacted in the strategy and the direction at the forefront of this, of fighting back, has also been like a really important practice to continue, right? Even when, again, we're seeing people in crisis and like, it's very natural and organic for us to want to help and be like, well, maybe this is what you can do, but like recenter and being like, well, what is it that you want to do, right? Do y'all want to keep fighting inside and outside? Like conditions are horrible. So I do think there's a strength in like our movement thinking about having a more like shared practice around like our work on the ground and that discipline that's also needed. Because we need a lot of different things, right, to really fight back in different like fronts.
This is also amazing to hear about. Thank you so much for sharing, Alejo and Megan. I think you've led us right into, the next part of our conversation. And, the question I wanted to ask is about the situation in LA and how everything went down there, what you were seeing and experiencing with the huge raids and the fight back from, everyday Angelinos. Yeah, just how do you make sense of all that you witnessed and, what have you learned? You were already gesturing to this, Alejo, about some of the lessons you've been pulling out from that struggle and that fight, but if you could just maybe expand a bit on what went down, how you all sort of organized to meet that struggle, and what you have learned and are still learning as a result.
Yes, of course. So yeah, I think like all of us could probably talk to this. It was actually like a really big like trip being in LA. I'm originally from LA, born and raised, but I've been living in the Bay, and I also been kind of coming back. So it's been like a trip being in LA and like seeing National Guard, like it's like seeing so much military on the ground, and then coming to the Bay, and it's a little quieter, right? I mean, there's still things happening here. But I do think one of the things that was very tough, and I'm sure Megan will speak to it, is just the snatching that happened, like just literally walking down the street. Like, I think probably a few of us, or there's a particular, LA is huge, it's really big, but for some of us who are like from like heart of LA, there's these specific districts, right? We're not talking about East LA, we're not talking about Boyle Heights, we're talking about like just like LA itself, and the districts or the neighborhoods that were being targeted is what Megan was talking about, like working class people, like jornaleros, carwacheros, right? Like immigrant communities. Or, I met a lot of folks in the Bay whose parents migrated to LA first, and they landed in one of the, they landed in K-Town, they landed in Pico Union, they landed in Westlake, downtown LA area. And I do think, I don't know, for Megan or Marcela, but the hardest thing has been is also seeing your neighbors getting kidnapped, right? We're talking about the tamaleras, the compañeras who make pupusas, like street vendors, right? That was like really tough, just like waking up in the mornings and hearing like who's not in that corner or a street anymore. So like acknowledging that, also, sharing, like our own internal assessment in Tubu was that, work sites seem to feel that it's like the first like tactic that this administration is taking in raids, right? And like very vulnerable places where working class people are working. And I want to uplift like ambience. That's what happened in ambience, right? It's a warehouse. It's a warehouse and a store. Our 43 workers got kidnapped. We didn't hear from them for days, like 5 days. This is during the time where due process was like a big question mark. Like we could not get a hold of our family. Attorneys could not get inside. I mean, I think y'all saw, like, if y'all saw the news, like politicians couldn't get inside, right? Nobody could get inside. And I think for us coming in and really supporting like indigenous communities, for what Marcela mentioned, right? Like indigenous Black, I mean, a lot of our, at this point it's racial profiling, right? But really focusing on indigenous communities is how we supported also like Lucha Zapoteca campaign, which is the one that, I'm here to share, and which Idebska has like thrown down for Marcela, with the Detention Watch Network has supported, Kiwa, Warehouse Workers Resource Center, Garment Worker Center, like a lot of worker centers came on and were like, how can we help? How can we support? And to be honest, the first question for them before any of like, how can we support is like, are y'all ready to like take on a campaign? Like, do y'all want to fight for the liberation of your family members? And I do want to uplift one very important piece on this is really having immigration attorneys that are movement partners in this, who believe in organizing, who like believe it in their core, and like immigration is like their thing, but they're also like believe in leadership, believe in organizing, believe in like shaking things up a little bit, right? All while also making sure that they are doing what's best for the client, right? Like inside. So I do think like for folks who might be listening who are attorneys, just make like being a movement partner right now is really important for organizers and for families. Like it's really helpful because the reality of it also is like neither me, I don't think Megan's an attorney, right? I don't, Megan, you're not an attorney. I know there's a few folks that sometimes are like, I'm also an attorney. I'm like, oh, we're not attorneys. Like, so when another attorney says, hey, this is actually best, of course, why wouldn't you listen to the expert on this, right? And when there's an attorney that says this is what best, and there's all these other opportunities that Megan, your organizer, is telling you that you should think about, like that's really helpful. That's really how we're able to make strong partnerships. So I really also want to give like a special shout out to CCHA, California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. They're like an amazing organization who really believe at this in its core and really supported and continue supporting us and like moving forward this campaign. But I will say that like one of the things that is needed is the support of families, right? That families want to take on. And we're also talking about mixed status families. And also that we need folks who have that experience. So I think that's where Marcela, like as soon as the families were like, yes, we want to fight, Marcela came in the next day and spent the whole day with the whole families. And we're talking about prepping, how to tell your story, holding the mic for the first time, trying to get a hold of people inside. And then right down the line, once we get a hold of folks, which, I feel like this could be a conversation for a lot, but I want to make space for Megan to also share, is that there's also some inside organizing that needs to happen while there's outside organizing, while there's the legal fight, right? Like there's all these components that need to happen to just make sure that I think two things are happening. One, families are feeling supported and they're getting the things that they need so they can continue fighting, right? Like therapy, like talking more about their healing, making sure they're getting like the resources they need. If the breadwinner or the family breadwinner is no longer there. And then inside is for folks who are inside to know that there's people outside fighting and that they can also push back inside, especially if we're talking about conditions. So I do think that there's a very unique opportunity to organize. I do feel, and this is just like our assessment at Tubu, there's a lot of support, as there should be, for rapid response, because that is important. And we are also seeing how community are coming out and responding. There's also much more investment that we need to do as organizers or movement people, in how are we supporting families once, it's been a little bit, I'm gonna slow down a little bit for interpretation. And there is another investment and commitment that as movement folks, we need to do in how are we supporting folks who are inside. And then how are we following up once they're liberated, right? So I will share, like in the Lucha Zapoteca campaign, out of 14, 11 have been liberated. 11 have been liberated and are still fighting for, folks who are inside. There's some folks who were deported within like 24 hours of their kidnapping. But really is, once folks are outside, right, once they're liberated, out on bond, and that's maybe Marcela at some point will mention, but there's all these other fights that happened during bond where like immigration now is being interpreted way different than it was ever before. I think it speaks to Marcela's like just sharing of the historical patterns that we're also seeing of different administrations, is how are we making sure that folks who are outside are able to support other workers who have not been detained, hopefully are not going to get kidnapped. Because one of the things that happens is like rarely does our community see someone who had kidnapped by ICE and see them outside, right? Like the administration really wants us to think like once you have been kidnapped, once you're detained, that's it. There's no hope. And I think some of us, and I'll speak for myself, I thought a little bit about that, right? I was like, is this it? Is this what happens? But it isn't, right? So just to say there's so much space for some of us who are seasoned organizers to learn from each other. And how are we making sure that we are transmitting that information, that energy, that knowledge to directly impacted families so that they can be the trusted messengers in our community to say, when you organize and you fight back, you do win, right? So I know sometimes it feels like things are really dark and gloomy, but I'm like, you know what? They're not totally winning. And that there's things that they're doing within the system, but the spirit and the opportunities of organizing are still present, and folks are really hungry and want to lean into that too, right? So I spoke a lot, but I'll pass it over to Megan. I think there's enough time for you to share too.
I mean, I think you touched on a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, so I won't repeat your points, which is good. And I think going back to looking at like Los Angeles specifically, I think there's also this, this narrative to what Alejo was talking about, like, oh my God, look at all this, disorder. Sorry, my language was all over the place there for us half a second. Look at all of this disorder. This is why we brought the military in, why we brought the National Guard. While that's happening, distracting from the fact that you had literal gangs of masked border patrol coming in 20 deep, full tactical gear, assault weapons, into the parking lots of Home Depots and grabbing and disappearing 20 workers at a time, sweeping through a whole row of street vendors, and taking all of them. So while the narrative was, look at all this disorder in the heart of Los Angeles, what was not being made visible in the national narrative was the militarization of the rest of Los Angeles. And who was the target of that? Working immigrants. And it's a very, very clear example of an attempt to literally change the racial and ethnic landscape of Los Angeles, which we already know has been underway, right? Whether it's been historically through redlining and pushing out Black communities who came here during the Great Migration, displacement of whole communities, to build mega sports stadiums like Chavez Ravine. Really what you're seeing is a complete change of neighborhoods, as Alejo referenced. So I think there's this tension of these narratives of what was being portrayed of what was happening in LA versus what our communities were experiencing, and I will say are still experiencing, right? To this day. Just this morning, a raid at a Home Depot disappeared 10 workers. So I think we're still trying to make sense of it because it continues to unfold. I think what we have seen and what we are learning is, one, you know, clearly what happened in Los Angeles and what continues to happen is really a testing ground for other parts of the United States, right? We already saw the remilitarization of Washington, D.C. We're seeing similar attacks at Home Depots against day laborers in Chicago. So clearly there's this sort of an experiment, for lack of a better word, on the part of a fascist federal government. I think also the other piece that's really important is that while this is also happening, there's also this third narrative that's happening by city officials, state officials, of a sort of resistance, entre comillas, that was being fought, you know, in city halls and press conferences. I mean, and I love a good press conference, don't get me wrong, but, you know, no photo op with any politician is going to help necessarily get a worker out of detention, to what Alejo was saying, right? Today, we got our first bond of a day laborer who was taken from us at the end of July, okay? From a Home Depot in North Hollywood today, okay? So do the math to see how long the process takes, right? To Alejo's point of this necessary organizing both inside and outside and working for a sustained period of time with families. You know, I like to compare what's happening in LA to two things. One, the beginning of the pandemic was not that far back, okay? We've seen natural disasters, you know, wildfires, floods, you know, in Puerto Rico, all the hurricanes where my people are from. And we see how it's not the state who has responded, it has been the community, right? You know, we call it mutual aid, and people think of mutual aid as, you know, giving food and giving money. But mutual aid is also about that organizing conversation that happens in those spaces, right? And there was a lot of talk about that in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And that's what's also happening now. So I think there's a very clear parallel to a lot of those mutual aid efforts to what we see happening now with the formation of patrols, solidarity networks, you know, coalition work. Some of the hardest organizing work in the world, right? But also the most critical right now. So I compare it to thinking about the natural disasters here and the global pandemic, but I think also looking back, you know, my original organizing work started in New York a million years ago. No, not a million, only 30, but working with families whose kids were being murdered by the NYPD when Giuliani was mayor back then. That's how old I am. And really thinking about these multi-pronged strategies about media, controlling the narrative, recontrolling the narrative, so that it's not, we push back against this, you know, it's just the criminals being taken. ICE is coming to these raids with full on media teams, okay? I have been at the end of one of those assault rifles twice, okay? And they have their full on media teams with them. And the next day we see this being created as propaganda on X and all these other corporate, you know, channels. So it's our job also to counter that narrative, to show who everyone is, right? As part and parcel of the landscape of Los Angeles, the landscape of the United States, the landscape of the Americas, the landscape of the world, right? So there's that media strategy that I think we've been leaning on more. I think the other thing that we need to look at is the criminalization of also the organizing and the organizers. When, at one of the raids at one of our day labor sites, they arrested one of IDESCA's staff members and a number of our volunteers, accusing them on social media, not through the legal channels, because we know the federal government uses legal channels as they like, como le da la gana. Sorry, I know I messed up the interpretation there by crossing languages. Perdón. But they arrested staff, they arrested volunteers, accusing them of obstruction of justice. So I think a lesson, there's also a lesson to be learned in terms of the way that the legal system can and cannot be used, and not relying necessarily so much on legal systems, on politicians, no matter how radical they say they are, but really looking at community solutions and really creating parallel structures. Because the reality is that if this is what happened already in Los Angeles in this short period of time, we're about to get an influx of dollars to DHS, right, and ICE. So it's going to get harder. So what that means, though, is that parallel structures need to be created to hold the line, literally, and also at the same time push those so-called progressives, right, to actually do things that are going to impact. Fun fact, day labor centers in the city of Los Angeles are funded by the city, are funded by partially by the city of Los Angeles. I have yet to have a meeting with the mayor of Los Angeles. I have not been invited to a press conference by her. Just saying. So I think also pushing, like, okay, then why are these day labor centers that you say are so important for the economic development of your city, at least on paper and contractually, right? Why aren't these declared protected spaces the same way schools are, the same way hospitals are, right? So I think really looking at all of those things as they're unfolding, and really looking at what's happening in Los Angeles as a testing ground to see how far can the federal government go and how will people resist. So I think that's why those parallel structures are really, really critical. And that's sort of what we're learning on the ground as we work with different formations of people. And look, we're a nonprofit, so, we have to tread lightly sometimes, but it's also our job as a nonprofit that is rooted in popular education to push the limits where we can and not comply in advance, because it's the safer thing to do, especially when we're thinking about who we're responsible to. And that really is our base of jornaleros and household workers. So yeah. Those are some of the things that we're learning on the ground now as we're continuing to see what's happening in LA. And I kept it to 10 minutes.
Nicely done, Megan. Thank you so much. I really appreciated the way you framed that about the sort of attempt to change the ethnic makeup of Los Angeles. I thought that was really clearly stated, and I appreciate that framing. I also love the way that you have shared with us so many different, important thoughts in this moment about, mutual aid as a potential site for organizing and coalition building, and this sort of like building of a network. And also thinking about that fight back and how folks are doing that in a way that actually pushes elected officials and doesn't lean on them just because they say they're progressive. And that's really new information to me about LA and the worker centers. And yeah, it's important for especially politicians who are saying that they want to promote a sanctuary city to be held to account around that. I think also you brought up so many useful threads between LA, the local fight, and the sort of larger national picture, which is what I wanted to turn to Marcela to help us understand, that Detention Watch Network is a national coalition. And so we're wanting to understand, like, how does this struggle within LA and within California relate to some of what's taking place in cities across the country? We've seen the ICE raids expanding in various cities around the country. Chicago recently We know that the big ugly bill has just passed and is going to skyrocket funding for ICE and for DHS. We've seen this the deployment of National Guard troops into DC. Trump is threatening to, or has already said that he will send National Guard into Memphis and potentially other cities. So, how can you just help us understand a little bit more, Marcela, about the national picture, the sort of overall strategy that the administration is trying to roll out here, their goals, whatever you can help us understand about what's going on in that bigger picture sense would be great here.
Yeah, and I think Megan and Alejo touched on it a little bit already, right? We can just expect the criminalization and making the police state bigger is going to be part of this fascist plan, right? And just continuing this horrific violence that's, both physical but also emotional and mental against our communities, right? Of having them lived under this anxiety, under this fear, of even walking down the street, of just, being human beings, of their freedom of movement, really, right? And we do see ICE being a key part of this fascist plan, but not only ICE, right? Alejo mentioned that in the raid for ambience, ICE was the last one to get there, right? That there was other agencies like the DEA, the local police department, LAPD, I believe she was saying the FBI. And I also think, right, we need to, yes, push back against ICE, call for the abolishment of ICE, but also all these other agencies that are being used and that are going to continue to be used, and interagency collaboration, right? We are seeing like hospitals trying to do medical deportations. We have been seen, which we have seen in the past, and actually Pennsylvania passed a whole state bill against that. And recently, I know we passed some things in California. But we really, have to think about this as a fight against the prison-industrial complex. And critical resistance defines the prison-industrial complex, which they use PIC for sure, as the overlapping interests of government, industry that use surveillance, policing, imprisonments, to target folks and as solutions for economic, social, and political problems that this government itself is creating. Right, we are with the big ugly bill, we are seeing that they defunded so many critical services for people in the United States, and even more for immigrants living in the United States, but gave all this funding to these agencies like ICE, like Border Patrol, for detention, right? So we do see that also, like Megan was talking about, the PIC maintains its power through scapegoating, dehumanizing certain communities, through mass media, through helping pass tough on crime legislation, and eliminating the social safety net, and attacking political dissent, and reorganizing the power of the US. So we're even seeing, right, how courts are being affected, how just like different institutions are being affected under this administration. And so what do we see is that we're going to continue to push back. Again, the bill provided a shocking $150 billion for immigration enforcement. This included $45 billion for detention over the next 4 years, but we know that they probably could use it at any point they want, right? Because they don't follow their own laws that are often also very unjust. We have heard that they want to deploy the National Guard to 20 states. And, that thing also is that negotiations for funding happen every year for the next fiscal year. And right now, we're actually having Congress, again, trying to add even more money to these agencies, and we're fighting back. The the congressional makeup is really bad right now, but we're still fighting back. We were able to stop funds the last Trump administration. But really, I think it's gonna be our organizing and our community fighting back. And just hearing Megan and Alejo about all how the communities are fighting back right now, not only in LA but across the country. You know, when I got involved in the movement against detention and deportation, after one of my loved ones was detained and deported, uh, the folks that were leading that movement, the Now One More movement, were jornaleros, right? Were workers, like the jornaleros in Louisiana, you know, they were fighting back in the South, the jornaleros in LA, like folks that are often the most criminalized in our communities, folks that were being detained, were leading hunger strikes inside of detention centers. And actually, it was because of hunger strikers in California that we got the attention of state legislators in California to help us draft and pass a bill to phase out detention centers that were a contract between local cities or local sheriffs or counties with the federal government, right? So it helped us reduce detention in California. It was because of them hearing about the hunger strikes that were happening inside of the detention centers. So I really think it's going to be, you know, we're against really great forces, but we also have a strong history of resisting and pushing back. And I really think, you know, because of all of that history of organizing in the past years, we did have a lot of great wins of ending some of the police-sized collaboration, defunding police departments. At some point, we did defund the amount of funding that went to detention. Right, and it has been the organizing, always the rapid response that has really pushed, like helped us keep us safe and fight against people being deported and for their liberation. And like Alejo and Megan were saying, when we first started organizing against people being deported, a lot of the first people that we were supporting were people that have been criminalized, that had you know, things that like DUIs or drug convictions, and you know, to really push back against the narrative that no one deserves to be deported, that you know, we need to address harm, we need through things like transformative justice, that we need to address things like addiction through like care, you know, to really push back against the criminalization of folks. And it was those folks and folks that were detained that were leading that fight and changing the narrative against that. And I think we're gonna have to continue to do that, and also think for the long term, right? Like what is the world that we want to live in? What is you know, how can we push locally and coordinate? And there's folks, yeah, like Alejo mentioned CCIJ. They were actually just supporting 100 people that went on hunger strike at the California City Detention Center that just opened without having the right permits, that became the largest detention center in California. And at the same time, another hunger strike started in Angola State Prison in Louisiana, where we are seeing now even states trying to take on immigration detention, like in Louisiana or like in Florida with Everglades, that a lot of folks know as Alligator Alcatraz. And yeah, I think it's community coming together and fighting back, and you know, really supporting the organizing of those directly impacted, what Megan's and coalition building in the fight against the Everglades facility, right? It was indigenous communities trying to protect the Everglades and their land that pushed back against this immigrant detention center being open and won in the courts. Right now, of course, the opposition is going to push back, and they reopened the facility, but you know, the fight continues. And I think the fight that we're seeing in LA is all across the United States, even abroad, with folks that are also fighting, you know, prisons like Secot or places like Guantanamo Bay. So I think, you know, we also need to think about these movements that are not only, we're in the belly of the beast. So also how are we connecting with other struggles across the world? Because, these governments, these fascist governments they communicate with each other, like we're seeing, right? Trump communicate with the president of El Salvador, and a lot of even European countries see the US criminalization and immigrant detention system as models. And there's folks fighting, I think, all across the world. And just, I think it's really going to be just us organizing, us fighting. That's really going to get us that win and protect ourselves and our communities. And it is very hard. It is right now, the violence is just so immense. And so many people are being affected and torn apart, and these institutions are really deadly. We have already seen more than almost 15 people, or 15, 16 people died inside of ICE detention centers. No one should, be in detention. One person in detention is too much. And we're, I think there's a lot of resistance all across the country by communities that are, being affected and directly impacted by the systems.
Thanks. That's so much that you've shared there. And I think it's really helpful for us to think through some of the connections that you're making between the, these struggles. What you spoke about in Florida, the land defense from indigenous communities, and then all the inside organizing from folks who are in detention, having an ability to exert pressure on, lawmakers and all of that. I think that's great. So important and useful. And I think, you also gestured to some of the needs that we see with the organizing that's happening and the organizers. And I sort of want to segue to a question for Alejo, who, you said when we talked a couple of days ago that green organizers probably won't have the skill sets to lead in this fight. And so I want to just throw it to you to draw out for us, what are the skills and the experience you see as being needed right now?
Yeah, and not to say that green organizers or new organizers shouldn't try it, but I do think it'd be setting up someone to burn out really quick as an organizer. And I think I mentioned it earlier. It's really important to have folks who are trauma informed, right? Being trauma informed is really important when we're talking to directly impacted communities. But really being able to have the skill sets to be able to move someone to action while they're also in crisis mode. And I think this is connected with what Megan was talking about, mutual aid. How are we also supporting each other, but not just giving a service, and really trying to take on the protagonism of that person who's already in front of me, seeking and wanting something and looking for connection, to also expand that into our community and really engage in what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about Tuba, which is how do we create this collective power, where it's feeling like everything, or the system and the administration around us is really trying to do anything possible to strip us away from anything that we have, and that makes us feel grounded and honestly human, right? And being able to engage with folks who are in trauma, who are going through crisis, it's not easy. But I know that there's a lot of us, there's folks here, right? The folks on the panel, right? We're seasoned organizers, and it's again, that thing that I was bringing up earlier, which is what is our commitment to the movement beyond, maybe our day jobs, beyond the things that make us feel comfortable, right? And then I also think another thing that's also important that I just want to share is also the commitment and supporting the development of folks who are liberated, right? What Marcela talked about is you're inside, you're so many skills. Wow, a lot of folks first hunger strike, right? A lot of folks for the first time are engaging with power in this way, and now that they're out, how are we continuing to engage with them in the larger fight, as folks who are directly impacted? And to be honest and real, sometimes we think because you're directly impacted, you shouldn't be in the forefront of the fight, and someone else should be able to fight that fight for you, right? And I think it's what Megan was talking about with popular education. Our role is really to push the limits and be we can also fight too. Some of us, and I know a lot of us, I know I can speak for myself, got to this work because someone else believed in my development and supported me and walked me through like these tough conversations, right? So how can we continue creating organizers in our movement?
Thanks, Alejo. That's so great to draw that out and highlight that about the skill set that folks need to have or need to be working toward. I want to toss a similar question to you, Megan, about, what do you see that's working on the ground right now and that people should be aiming to replicate? And where do you see there are some gaps that might need to be filled right now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I talked a little bit about some of the things that I think are working, the creation of parallel models, and not just parallel models in terms of, patrolling, support. I think like really using our imaginations to experiment. A lot of the day labor centers, for example, were places where workers went to look for work to provide, for their families, which is not happening right now. So how do we also reimagine, the economic system, right, across Los Angeles for day laborers, for street vendors, for car wash workers, some of the most impacted workers in Los Angeles, to look towards a more cooperative model, which could be actual co-ops, but could also be like, what does it look like to actually bring community together, the same community that's patrolling with you, fighting for release, fighting against the crappy conditions in detention center, to also be like, oh yeah, and also let's make sure that like you're working in this community as well so that you can continue to take care of yourself. So those are things that we're experimenting with while we're fighting and doing defense and the organizing. I think another thing that's really important, and not to be all California and woo-wooey, but I've lived here for long enough that like I don't know about you, but like I didn't end up in Los Angeles, or my family didn't end up in the United States necessarily because we wanted to, right? This was not a we came here because of United States interventions in our homelands, and that means that our people know something about survival because we're all still here, right? So there is something to be said about tapping into that as well, in terms of looking like what happened. We were talking about global struggles, right? What has been happening for generations in Palestine, in Gaza, amidst a genocide, and what can be learned there? We have seen what the United States has done in cases where they're disappearing thousands of people, like in Chile and Argentina, working alongside fascist governments. What can we learn from those examples as well? And what can we learn from ourselves, from our own ancestors as well? So I think there's something to be said about that. And to not be afraid to say that, as woo-woo-y as it sounds, like that's how we survived to this point, right? I think what's not working and what are some of the gaps, and I alluded to, let's stop waiting for the politicians to do something or legal systems to do something. But I think also really it can be so overwhelming, everything that's happening, right? And we're not experiencing one type of attack in our communities. We as immigrants, as people of color, as Black, brown, queer, indigenous people, we're facing a multitude of attacks. So I think also don't feel, there's this sense of desperation that I think can kind of make us feel stuck. Like, where do I even begin? And I think just beginning, yes, to Alejo's point, like, yeah, no, don't just show up, be like, I'm gonna come and now I'm gonna save all of this, right? But join a community, talk to your neighbors. What's the plan in your building if something goes down? Like, it doesn't even have to be this grand, huge thing. Have that conversation, I think, with your neighbor, you know, with the person at the market that you see every day. And I think that is how we practice organizing in everyday life, and let's make that normal instead of just this constant reaction to.
Thanks for that. And I appreciate the California woo-woo. I think that's great. How can we get grounded in all the different modalities we're able to do that? So I think that's very useful. I want to turn to you, Marcela, and just ask you a little bit about, I know that you're a trainer with the Ruckus Society, which helps folks get skilled up for direct action. We have been seeing mass mobilization, tons of people turning out in reaction to various kinds of attacks. Like in the Bay Area, we've seen big crowds showing up to shut down immigration courts to prevent abductions and deportations. And this is very exciting. And I just want to know, like, do you, from your perspective, feel like mobilizing large crowds in that way is the most effective use of our energies right now? Are there other kinds of direct action that folks should be getting involved in? Is there more proactive type of work that folks should be focusing on? And, can you share any examples of organizing that we would do well to take as models for how we're fighting back right now?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think also Alejo and Megan just spoke to this earlier. Direct action has been really important to our movements, especially when we're seeing these institutions that have been really unjust since the beginning, against, communities of color, immigrant communities, like courts, crumble down even more under this administration. And also, our Rockets would teach that direct action can take many forms, right? And that also direct action is supposed to be part of a bigger vision, of a bigger campaign, of a bigger goal. And also that there is a role for everybody in the movement, right? There is this thing called like the social change ecosystem map, where yes, we do need those frontline responders that are gonna show up, in the front lines to stop literally like folks from being kidnapped, snatched by ICE, to stop, that was a type of direct action we used a lot in the Now One More movement. But again, it was part of a bigger campaign. It wasn't just like, let's stop a deportation bus. Like, we were in contact with the folks that were in that deportation bus. We got prepared. We talked about safety and security, and it was part of a bigger campaign. And we had demands and we had targets, right? And we also had folks get engaged for the long term in our campaign. It wasn't just like a one-off action and that's it, right? There were very specific goals when we did direct action, either to actually stop somebody from being deported that day, to get more time to get them out of detention and fight for the liberation, but also maybe was it to change the narrative, to demand a very specific change in our community, was it to get more folks engaged in our movement for the long term. And also part of this ecosystem map is there are folks, again, that are going to be those frontline responders. And then there's also folks that are going to be things like the weavers, the storytellers, the healers, the caregivers, right? And I think definitely we need folks on the streets doing Ice Watch, doing these patrols. If folks, are able to put their bodies on the line to defend our communities. And also, there are other roles that we need in the movement. And we really need to think about it as not an isolated response, but as part of more of a long-term plan on how we're going to resist and how we're going to change things in our communities for the long term.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I had thought that I would ask folks about, what examples and models you want to kind of highlight as inspiration for this fight, but I feel that each of you has touched on this And so thank you for, being so grounded in the examples that you're sharing and helping folks to understand like what is working, what resources are out there, and which people are sort of doing this in a way that's going to be replicable to be effective. I want to ask you all if there are any things that you haven't said or that I haven't asked you about that feel important to share here. And then there is also a question from somebody in the Q&A. I'm not sure if y'all saw it, but I can share that. And there's also just this more general question for each of you about, are there things you want to share that haven't come up yet in this conversation? So any order, thank y'all so much.
All right, sorry, as a born and raised New Yorker, I'm gonna jump in. Sorry, not sorry. Who also was organizing against NYPD violence back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So yeah, I think, do you think New York City is siloed? Don't come to LA. First of all, ha, joking, not really. But just, I think in terms of really thinking, again, it has to be about coalition building. That's sort of what helped in terms of when we were fighting, Giuliani, as his police force was, literally murdering Black and brown children, right? In the 90s and early 2000s. I think look at the work of the New York City Coalition Against Police Brutality that started back then. People's Justice 2000. We look back at what happened, for example, when Abner Louima was brutalized, and the horrible assassination of Amadou Diallo. There's really great examples of cross-racial, cross-ethnic, cross-sector organizing. We managed one time to close all the entrances in and out of the city one time, right? All the bridges and tunnels with students taking one entrance, police anti-police brutality organizers shutting down another bridge. And yes, that was pre 9/11. So things have changed. We do have to acknowledge that. But we're a smart ass creative people. And we have smart ass creative organizers in New York. So I think look to those examples of really cross-racial, cross-ethnic, and have the hard conversations. We're not always going to agree. I think that's the thing too. There's a expectation that within organizing and within coalition, we all have to agree. We gotta hash shit out sometimes, and it's okay to hash that stuff out. And then figure out what are the things that we are willing to negotiate with one another on, so that we're not negotiating that with the people we're fighting against, right? So I think be willing to engage in that conflict internally. That's really, really important to break down those silos. I think that's really, really going to be critically important as we're looking to what happens. But I'm also happy to talk to y'all offline and share more of my experiences back from organizing in New York. I think the only other thing that I will share that hasn't been mentioned or it's been touched upon is also like for organizers, please take care of yourselves. Like, I know that's not a sexy thing. My mentors were, members of the Young Lords Party, Black Liberation Army, and they were not good examples, God bless them all, of taking care of themselves. And a lot of them died young, honestly, because they did not take care of themselves. I can remember my mentor, Richie Perez, like limping through a march, and this is a long struggle because it's not just about the next 3 years and a month, right? It's also about what happens next, right? To really build that community around yourself as well, or find that community so that you can tap out. It doesn't have to be forever, right? But you're going to need to catch your breath, and that's really what part of the work is too, so that we're not burning ourselves out in the process, right? Because esto va para largo. This is going to be a long-term fight that's going to require a lot of long-term vision and implementation well beyond the next 3 years and however many months we have left of this regime.
I'm over here trying to listen to Megan's advice. I'm like, oh yeah, take care of yourselves. That's true and that's right. And 100% what Megan said about taking care of ourselves. And it's not just 3 years, right? Or 4. We are looking at I hate to say it, but a very well organized and resourced, right? Right? Like they are really thinking long term and they've been thinking long term before we've been thinking long term, right? And I do think one of the things that I do want to like uplift now, especially about the silo, because yes, I saw that in LA. I was like, what the heck is like happening here? Came to the Bay. I feel like in the Bay we're a little better, and there's a little bit of that also just shows up just like organically because we're all trying to respond and put down fires. So, um, but I kind of will go back to what I was saying earlier, which there's also nothing wrong with like staying in our lane of this one thing that we might be really good at. Like we don't have to we don't have to do it all. Like we don't have to be the rapid response. We don't and the persons that do the representation and the people that go and shut down the court. And so it's like, what is that one thing that we are able to do and that we can go deep, right? I don't think we have, it's like it's not a number right now. It's really not a number game when we're talking about skill set and survival. It's like really what's that skill set that we can go deeper in and like support others. Like Marcela's like direct action, but hey, direct action is not just blocking something for the sake of blocking something. It's like how are we able to offer these lessons to like everyone else who's really wanting to take on a role. So I do think like saying that and also just sharing. I know that I was just like we queen organizers, we need this, but also like kind of what Megan was sharing, like start those conversations, those difficult conversations, and sometimes honestly even just having them with family is like a good like little warm up of like, oh damn, this is not as easy as I thought it would be. I always tell everyone, people think that having conversations with your family is the easiest. It's actually the hardest, right? It's the hardest. Um, so I do think uplifting that the importance of like, even if you're not like a seasoned organizer, what is that role? And as we understand that silos do exist and it can be harder and harder to work in partnership, feeling comfortable and confident and staying in that one thing and going deep and making connections. I do want to acknowledge that not all of us are part of the nonprofit system, right? There's some of us who like clock out of work and ex-office or, this other, retail work and then showing up and studying and trying to show up in the best ways that we can. And I think one of the things that I continue hearing from us, like uplifting, that I don't think we've said yet, is like connecting directly to the base, right? Like building up other folks with us. Honestly, even something as simple as like, hey, have you heard of like the Center for Public Education? This is what here's the link. I think like there's folks who are hungry for things, and let's be real, right? Like TikTok and Facebook is not going to be the best politicization for our people right now. So I just wanted to say, like, it's also not like being on the ground if that's not the skill sets that you have, but what are they, and can you go like deeper, and can we go a little deep and create our own spaces, right? When that once and building that muscle, so once we need to show up in the ways that we need to, we feel ready and prepared.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Megan and Alejo have been saying. I was actually recently introduced to this kind of thinking of like thinking, what is the change that we want to make 7 generations from us, right? That comes from like indigenous struggle. And yeah, because our, the folks that are forming all these oppression systems and attacking us, like Alejo said, they have those long-term plans. So for us, it's like, what is the change? What is the world that we want to see 7 generations from now? And what are we doing now to build up to that change? And also, what are we learning from 7 generations back? Definitely our landscape is completely different, and not, the tactics and strategies that even worked 4 years ago are not gonna work now. And also, like, what can we learn? Like Megan was saying, from our, our ancestors. And yeah, that, everybody does have a place in the movement. It could be like childcare, the artists. I really think, we need to be more creative with the ways we take action. I really think sometimes art or communications, it's like we think about that last, and it's like, no, that is how we're gonna really make an impact on how people perceive the systems and how people can plug in and how we're gonna imagine another future. So yeah, I think putting more investment into art communications is something. And yeah, like how are we investing in the growth of folks, and how to, yeah, taking care of ourselves. I think I actually just transitioned out of being director of organizing at EWN to being capacity building director, to really, support that. And also stepping back a little bit from some of that and opening space for other folks to do some of that. And I think also just continue to study and learning about the systems we are against, right? Because yeah, they're really complex, they're really oppressive. And then sometimes just like taking a step back and really knowing, okay, what are the different ways we are pushing back, and not, and for the long term, and building for the long term, and not only reacting. And how are we engaging folks for the long term as well, not only showing up to a march or signing a petition, but like what is that um journey that we want to have them take in order to continue to be engaged, because that is what we have, right? We have numbers, and we are the ones that keep us safe, and we have seen that with these attacks against ICE and other agencies and this government, right? Like we are the ones keeping us safe and providing for ourselves.
Okay, thank you for these responses. I appreciate it. Yeah, so Alejo, if we can just throw it to you to talk to us a little bit about this current campaign to stop the creation of an immigrant detention center in Dublin, California. We'd love to know more, and folks might want to know how they can get involved.
Yeah, I can do this really briefly. So the ICE out of Dublin coalition formed in response to the news that ICE is hoping to reopen a facility out in Dublin. In March 2025, ICE began making moves to reopen the prison as a detention center. So a little bit about the prison itself. It used to be a women's prison out in Dublin. A lot of horrible things happen inside, like they happen in all prisons and all detentions and any place that wants to catch of people. And after a lot of organizing inside and outside, they were able to successfully close down that prison. There's just a little bit of trigger warning, a lot of like abuse, harassment, and just a lot of pain. And so there was a big victory for us at in the Bay, when, our compañeras were able to close down that, our comrades were able to close down that prison. And then in March, we started hearing that ICE is starting to think about reopening this prison into a detention center. I mean, in addition to it being a symbol of abuse, the prison is also filled with mold, asbestos, crumbling infrastructure, that was one of things that was making people really sick when they were locked up. Another thing was that the former director of BOP said that they would need tens of millions of dollars to make repairs. And I think, want to uplift what Marcela shared with us about, like, there's this big budget coming down, right? Like, what is that looking like? So different organizations, community members came together and formed what is now the ICE out of Dublin coalition. And our coalition really believes that no one should be deported or incarcerated, and we believe in uplifting the work. We believe in making sure that we're uplifting the humanity and dignity of all people, regardless of immigration status and criminal convictions. So one of the things that we're really focusing on right now is making sure that we're letting our NorCal community know about this. There might be a lot of us in the Bay have been kind of brainstorming and thinking, like, when is the Bay next? Why are we not? What's going on, right? It feels like it's any moment. And I will say that one of the things that some of us have thought about a lot is that, having a detention center in Dublin would like completely change that for everyone, not only the Bay, but NorCal. We talk about how if they have 125, 150 beds, they will fill that out. So a lot of our purpose right now is to talk to our neighbors and our community in Dublin as well as sharing this information with all folks all over the Bay, North Cal. Make sure that we are in communication and coordinating with other efforts around California too. There's going to be a link that we're going to drop in the chat if folks want to. There's a petition, and that's the best way to get updated on our efforts. Again, right now, it's really, that's one of the things about this administration. They're really just kind of, it's waiting for us to respond, right? Like, I think it was May who was just like, we don't need to just respond. Like, let's get ready. Let's build up this muscle, because that's what the administration is planning for. They want us to just react. So we're doing building community, making sure that we're all coming together. I believe 2 weeks ago, there was a beautiful action that was done outside by Courage, an organization here in the Bay Area of like young people. So yeah, hoping that folks can sign our petition. That's the best way to get emails and be updated on what our efforts are looking like in Dublin and the Bay Area.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejo, for sharing about that Ice Out of Dublin campaign. And thank you, all three panelists, Alejo, Marcela, Megan. This has been such a great learning experience, and just appreciate you all so much for both the work that you're doing and the time that you've taken to share it with all of us and the wisdom that you've gained from it. This has been really great, and just want to share deepest gratitude to all of you. Okay, and thanks to everyone who's been watching from home and folks who will watch this on the YouTube. We appreciate YouTube. Is there anything else I should say, Thomas, before we close it out?
No, I think you're good. Thank you, everyone. And we'll close out with some ways to stay connected, and we'll if you sign up for alerts, we'll alert you to the next session. But thanks so much for joining us.